Hello everyone, this is Cameron Ayana and I'm back with you guys again with another video. I'm continuing my read aloud on the book called The Uninhabitable Earth, Life After Warming by David Wallace Wells. I told you guys I was going to finish it, so I'm going to push through. So I'm going to start with where we left off. So now we're on page 86, and we're going to go to 94, or should we just go to 100? I think we should just go to 100. Okay, so from 86 to 100, we're going to read about 3 chapters. And in these 3 chapters, we're reading about fresh water drain, dying oceans, and unbreathable air. Yes. Okay. Page 86. Bring this a little closer. Okay. Pretty sure you can hear me louder now. Okay. 86. Fresh water drain. 71% of the planet is covered in water. Barely more than 2% of that is fresh, and only 1% of that water, at most, is accessible, with the rest trapped mostly in glaciers, which means, in essence, as National Geographic has calculated, only 0.007% of the planet's water is available to fuel and feed its 7 billion people. Think of fresh water shortages, and you probably feel an itch in your throat. But in fact, hydration is just a sliver of what we need water for. Globally, between 70 and 80% of fresh water is used for food production and agriculture, with an additional 10 to 20% set aside for industry. And the crisis is not principally driven by climate change. That 0.007% should be, believe it or not, plenty. Not just for the 7 billion of us here, but for as many as 9 billion, perhaps even a bit more. Of course, we are likely heading north of 9 billion this century, to a global population of at least 10 and possibly 12 billion. As with food scarcity, much of the growth is expected in parts of the world already most strained by water shortage. In this case, urban Africa. In many African countries, already, you are expected to get by on at least 20 liters of water each day, less than half of what water organizations say is necessary for public health. As soon as 2030, global water demand is expected to outstrip supply by 40%. Today, the crisis is political, which is to say, not inevitable or necessary or beyond our capacity to fix, and therefore functionally elective. That is one reason it is nevertheless harrowing as a planet parable. An abundant resource made scarce through governmental neglect and indifference, bad infrastructure, and contamination, careless urbanization and development. There is no need for a water crisis, in other words, but we have one anyway, and aren't doing much to address it. Some cities lose more water to leaks than they deliver to homes. Even in the US, leaks and theft wait, leaks and theft account for an estimated loss of 16% of fresh water. In Brazil, the estimate is 40%. In both cases, as everywhere, scarcity plays out so nakedly on a stage defined by have and have not inequities, that the resulting drama of resource competition can hardly be called truly a competition. The deck is so stacked that water shortage looks more like a tool of inequality. The global result is that as many as 2.1 billion people around the world do not have access to safe drinking water, and 4.5 billion don't have safely managed water or sanitation. Like global warming, the water crisis is solvable at present, but that 0.007% leaves an awfully thin margin, and climate change will cut into it. Half of the world's population demands a seasonal melt from high elevation snow and ice deposits that are dramatically threatened by warming. Even if we hit the Paris targets, the glaciers of the Himalayas will lose 40% of their ice by 2100, or possibly more. And there could be widespread water shortages in Peru and California. The result of glacier melt. At 4 degrees, the snow-capped Alps could look more like Morocco's Atlas Mountains, with 70% less snow by the end of the century. As soon as 2020, as many as 250 million Africans could face water shortages due to climate change. By the 2050s, the number could hit a billion in Asia alone. By the same year, the World Bank found fresh water availability in cities around the world could decline by as much as two-thirds. Overall, according to the United Nations, 5 billion people could have poor access to fresh water by 2050. The United States won't be spared, boomtown Phoenix is. For instance, already in emergency planning mode, which should not surprise wait, which should not surprise given that even London is beginning to worry over water shortages. But given the re but given the reassurances of wealth which can buy stopgap solutions and additional short-term supply, the United States will not be the worst hit. In India, already 600 million face high to extreme water stress, according to 2018 government report, and 200,000 people die each year from lacking or contaminated water. By 2030, according to the same report, India will have only half the water it needs. In 1947, when the country was formed, per capita water availability in Pakistan stood at 5,000 cubic meters. Today, that's mostly thanks to mostly population growth. It is at 1,000, and soon continued growth and climate change will bring it down to 400. In the last 100 years, many of the planet's largest lakes have begun drying up, from the Aral Sea in Central Asia, which was once the world's fourth largest and which has lost more than 90% of its volume in recent decades, to Lake Mead, which supplies much of Las Vegas's water and has lost as much as 400 billion gallons in a single year. Lake Pulpo, once Bolivia's second biggest, has completely disappeared. Iran's lake, Urmia, has shrunk more than 80% in 30 years. Lake Chad has more or less evaporated entirely. Climate change is only one factor in this story, but its impact is not going to shrink over time. What goes on within those lakes that survive is perhaps just as distressing. In China's Lake Tai, for instance, the blooming of warm water friendly bacteria in 2007 threatened the drinking water of 2 million people. The heating up of East Africa's Lake Tanganyika has imperiled the fish stock harvest and eaten by millions in four adjacent, hungry nations. Freshwater lakes, by the way, account up to 16% of the world's natural methane emissions, and scientists estimate that climate-fueled aquatic plant growth could double those emissions over the next 50 years. We're already racing, as a short-term fix for the world's drought boom, to drain underground water deposits known as aquifers, but those deposits took millions of years to accumulate and aren't coming back anytime soon. In the United States, aquifers already supply a fifth of our water needs. As Brian Clark Howard has noted, wells that used to draw water at 500 feet now require pumps at least twice as deep. The Colorado River Basin, which serves over to 7 states, lost 12 cubic meters of underground water between 2004 and 2013. The Ogallala Aquifer in part of the Texas Panhandle lost 15 feet in a decade and is expected to drain by 70% over the next 50 years in Kansas. In the meantime, they're fracking in that drinking water. In India, in just the next 2 years, 21 cities could exhaust their groundwater supply. The first day zero in Cape Town was in March 2018, the day when the city, a few months earlier and enduring its worst drought in decades, had predicted its taps would run proverbially dry. Sitting in a living room in a modern apartment in an advanced metropolis somewhere in the developed world, this threat may seem hard to credit. So most cities looking nowadays like fantasies of endless and on-demand abundance for the world's wealthy. But of all urban entitlements, the casual expectation of never-ending drinking water is perhaps the most deeply delusional. It takes quite a lot to bring that water to your sink, your shower, and your toilet. As climate arises so often do, in Cape Town the drought aggravated existing conflicts. In a memorable first-person account written at the time, Cape Townian Adam Wells described this episode, which did end before the city went completely dry, as an operatic enactment of familiar local problems, mostly wealthy whites complaining that mostly poor blacks, many of whom receive a small allocation fee, were draining the water supply. Social media aflame with accusations of idle or indifferent black South Africans leaving water pipes running unattended and shantytown businesses running off stolen water. Black South Africans pointed the finger at suburban whites with pools and lawns, making hay over orgies of flushing in the toilet stalls of upscale shopping malls. conspiracy theories circulated involving federal indifference and withheld Israeli technology, and accusations of bad faith bounced from local authorities to national ones to meteorologists, altogether serving, as is almost always the case when communities must respond collectively to climate threats, as a buffet of excuses to not act. At the peak of this crisis, the mayor announced that nearly two-thirds of the city, 64%, were failing to abide by the city's new water restrictions, which aim to limit water use to 23 gallons per person each day. The average American goes through 4 or 5 times that much. In arid Utah, founded on a Mormon prophecy predicting the arrival of an Eden in the desert, the average citizen goes through each day 248 gallons. In February, Cape Town halved the individual allotment to 13 gallons, and the Army prepared to secure the city's water facilities. But accusations of individual irresponsibility were a kind of weaponized red herring, as they often are in communities reckoning with the onset of climate pain. We frequently choose to obsess over personal consumption, in part because it is within our control, and in part as a very contemporary form of virtue signaling. But ultimately, those choices are, in most all cases, trivial contributors, ones that blind us to the more important forces. When it comes to fresh water, the bigger picture is this: personal consumption amounts to such a thin silver that only in the most extreme droughts can it even make a difference. Even before the drought, one estimate found that South Africa had 9 million people without any access to water for personal consumption at all. The amount of water required to satisfy the needs of those millions is only about one-third of the amount of water used each year to produce the nation's wine crop. In California, where droughts are punctuated by outrage over pools and evergreen lawns, total urban consumption accounts for only 10%. In South Africa, eventually the crisis passed, a combination of aggressive water rationing and the end of the dry season. But you could be forgiven, considering the news coverage of Cape Town, for thinking that the South African city was the first to stare down a day zero. In fact, Sao Paulo did it in 2015, after a 2-year drought, limiting water use to 12 hours a day for some residents in an aggressive rationing system that shuttered businesses and forced mass layoffs. In 2008, Barcelona, facing the worst drought the city had since Catalinas began keeping records, had to barge in drinking water from France. In southern Australia, the Millennium Drought began with low rainfall in 1996 and continued through a Death Valley like drought that lasted 8 years, beginning in 2001 and ending only when La Nina rainfall finally relieved the area in 2010. Rice and cotton production in the region fell 99 and 84%, respectively. Rivers and lakes shriveled up and wetlands turned acidic. In 2018, in the Indian city of Shimla, once the summertime home of British Raj, the taps ran dry for weeks in May and June. And while agriculture is often hit the hardest by shortages, water issues are not executively ruled. 14 of the world's 20 biggest cities are currently experiencing water scarcity or drought. 4 billion people, it is estimated, already live in regions facing water shortages at least 1 month each year. That's about 2/3 of the planet's population. 500 million are in places where the shortages never end. Today, at just 1 degree of warming, those regions with at least a month of water shortages each year include just about all of the United States west of Texas, where lakes and aquifers are being drained to meet demand, and stretching up into western Canada and down to Mexico City. Almost all almost all of North Africa and Middle East at large, a large chunk of India, almost all of Australia, significant parts of Argentina and Chile are, and everything in Africa south of Zambia. As long as it has had advocates, climate change has been sold under a saltwater banner, melting Arctic, rising seas, shrinking coastlines. A freshwater crisis is more alarming since we depend on it far more acutely. It is also closer at hand, but while the planet commands the necessary resources today to provide water for drinking and sanitation to all the world's people, there is not the necessary political will or even the inclination to do so. Over the next 3 decades, water demand from the global food system is expected to increase by about 50%, from cities and industry by 50 to 70%, and from energy by 85%. And climate change, with its coming mega droughts, promises to tighten supply considerably. In fact, the World Bank, in its landmark study of water and climate change, high and dry, found that the impacts of climate change will be channeled primarily through the water cycle. The bank's foreboding warning that when it comes to the cruelly cascading effects of climate change, water efficiency is a pressing problem and as important a puzzle to solve as energy efficiency. Without any meaningful adaptation in the distribution of water resources, the World Bank estimates regional GDP could decline, simply due to water insecurity, by as much as 14% in the Middle East, 12% in Africa's Sahel, 11% in Central Asia, and 7% in East Asia. But of course, GDP is at best a crude measure of environmental cost. A more eye-opening ledger is kept by Peter Gielich of the Pacific Institute. A simple list of all armed conflicts tied up with water issues beginning in 3000 BC with the ancient Sumerian legend of Ea. Gielich lists nearly 500 water-related conflicts since the 1900s. Almost half of the entire list is since just 2010. Part of that, Gielich acknowledges, is a reflection of the relative abundance of recent data, and part of it is the changing nature of war, conflicts, that used to unfold almost exclusively between states are now, in an era where state authority has weakened in many places, likely to spark within states and between groups. The 5 years wait, the 5 year Syrian drought that stretched from 2006 to 2011, producing crop failures that created political instability and helped usher in the civil war that produced a global refugee crisis, is one vivid example. Gielich is personally more focused on the strange war unfolding in Yemen since 2015, technically a civil war, but practically a proxy regional war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and conceptually a sort of world war in miniature, with American and Russian involvement as well. There, the humanitarian cost has been carried as much by water as by blood, in part because of targeted attacks on water infrastructure. The number of cholera causes grew to 1 million in 2017, which means in a single year, roughly 4% of the country contracted the disease. There's a saying in the water community, Gielich tells me. If climate change is a shark, the water resources are the teeth. Page 94. Dying oceans. We tend to see oceans as unfathomable, the closest thing we have on this planet to outer space, dark, forbidding, and especially in the depths, quite weird and mysterious. Who has known this ocean? Rachel Carson wrote in her essay Undersea, published by 25 years before she tackled the desecration of the planet's land by human hands and industrial carouse in Silent Spring. Neither you nor I, with our earthbound senses, know the foam and surge of the tide that beats over the crab hiding under the seaweed of his tide pool home, or the tilt of the long, slow swells of mid-ocean, where shoals of wandering fish prey and are preyed upon, and the dolphins' beaks, the waves to breathe the upper atmosphere. But the ocean isn't the other. We are. Water is not a beachside attraction for land mammals. At 70% of the Earth's surface, it is, by an enormous margin, the planet's predominant environment. Along with everything else it does, oceans feed us. Globally, seafood accounts for nearly a fifth of an all animal protein in the human diet, and in coastal areas it can provide much more. The oceans also maintain our planetary seasons through prehistoric currents like the Gulf Stream, and modulate the temperature of the planet, absorbing much of the heat of the sun. Perhaps has maintained, and has modulated are better terms, since global warming threatens to undermine each of those functions. Already, fish populations have migrated north by hundreds of miles in search for colder waters, foundered by 250 miles off the American East Coast. Mackerel, so far mackerel, so far from their continental home that the fishermen chasing them are no longer bound by rules set by the European Union. One study tracing human impact on marine life found that 13% of the ocean undamaged, and Parts of the Arctic have been so transformed by warming that scientists are beginning to wonder how long can they keep calling those waters Arctic. And however much sea level rise and coastal flooding have dominated our fears about the impact of climate change on the planet's ocean water, there is much more than just that to worry over. At present, more than a fourth of the carbon emitted by humans is sucked up by the oceans, which also in the past 50 years have absorbed 90% of global warming's excess heat. Half of that heat has been absorbed since 1997, and today's seas carry at least 15% more heat energy than they did in the year 2000, absorbing 3 times as much additional energy in just those 2 decades, as it is contained in the entire planet's fossil fuel reserves. But the result of all that carbon dioxide absorption is what's called ocean acidification, which is exactly what it sounds like, and which is also already burning through some of the planet's water basins. You may remember these as the place where life arose in the first place, all on its own, through its effect on photoplankton, which release sulfur into the air that helps cloud formation. Ocean acidification could add between a quarter and a half a degree of warming. You have probably heard of coral bleaching, that is, coral dying, in which warmer ocean waters strip reefs of the protozoa called zooxanthella that provide through photosynthesis up to 90% of the energy needs of the coral. Each reef is an ecosystem as complex as a modern city, and the zooxanthella are its food supply, the basic building block of an energy chain, when they die, the whole complex is starved with military efficiency, a city under siege or blockade. Since 2016, as much as half of Australia's landmark Great Barrier Reef has been stripped in this way. These large-scale die-outs are called mass bleaching events. One unfolded globally from 2014 to 2017. Already coral life has declined so much that it has created an entirely new layer in the ocean, between 30 and 150 meters below the surface, which scientists have taken to calling a twilight zone. According to the World Resources Institute, by 2030, ocean warming and acidification will threaten 90% of all reefs. This is very bad news, because reefs support as much as a quarter of all marine life and food supply and income for 500 million people. They also protect against flooding from storm surges, a function that offers value in the many billions. With reefs presently worth at least $400 million annually in Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Cuba, and Mexico, $400 million annually to each. Ocean acidification will also damage fish populations directly. Though scientists aren't yet sure how to predict the effects on the huff we haul out of the ocean to eat. They do know that in acid waters, oysters and mussels will struggle to grow their shells, and that rising carbon concentrations will impair fishes' sense of smell, which you may have which you may not have known they had, but which often aids in navigation. Off the coast of Australia, fish populations have declined in an estimated 32% in just 10 years. It has become quite common to say that we are living through a mass extinction, a period in which human activity has multiplied the rate at which species are disappearing from the earth by a factor perhaps as large as 1,000. It is probably also fair to call this an era marked by what is called ocean anoxification. Over the past 50 years, the amount of ocean water with no oxygen at all has quadrupled globally, giving us a total of more than 400 dead zones. Oxygen-deprived zones have grown by several million square kilometers, roughly the size of all of Europe, and hundreds of coastal cities now sit on fatigued, under-oxygenated ocean. This is partly due to the simple warming of the planet, since warmer waters can carry less oxygen, but it is also partly the result of straightforward pollution. A recent, sorry, um, where was I? A recent Gulf of Mexico dead zone, all 9,000 square miles of it, was powered by the runoff of fertilizer chemicals washing into the Mississippi from the industrial farms of the Midwest. In 2014, a non-atypical toxic event struck Lake Erie when fertilizer from corn and soy farms in Ohio spawned an algae bloom that cut off drinking water for Toledo. And in 2018, a dead zone the size of Florida was discovered in the Arabian Sea, so big that researchers believed it might encompass the entire 63,700 square mile Gulf of Oman, 7 times the size of the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. The ocean, said the lead researcher Bastien Queste, is suffocating. Drastic declines in ocean oxygen have played a role in many of the planet's worst mass extinctions, and this process by which dead zones grow, choking off marine life and wiping out fisheries, is already quite advanced, not only in the Gulf of Mexico, but just off Namibia, where hydrogen sulfide is bubbling out of the sea along a 1,000-mile stretch of land known as the Skeleton Coast. The name originally referred to the detritus of wrecked ships, but today it's more apt than ever. Hydrogen sulfide is also one of the things scientists suspect finally capped the end Permian extinction. Once all the feedback loops had been triggered, it is also toxic. It is so toxic that evolution has trained us to recognize the teeniest, safest traces, which is why our noses are so exquisitely skilled at registering flatulence. And then there's the possible slowdown of the ocean. Conveyor belt, the great circulatory system made up of the Gulf Stream and other currents that is the primary way the planet regulates regional temperatures. How does this work? The water of the Gulf Stream cools off the atmosphere of the Norwegian Sea, making the water itself denser, which sends it down into the bottom of the ocean, where it is then pushed southward by more Gulf Stream water, itself cooling in the north and falling to the ocean floor eventually all the way to Antarctica, where the cold water returns to the surface and begins to heat up and travel north. The trip can take 1,000 years. As soon as the conveyor belt became the subject of real study in the 1980s, there were those oceanographers who worried it might shut down, which would lead to a dramatic disequilibration of the planet's climate. The hotter parts getting much hotter and the colder parts getting much colder. A total shutdown would be inconvenientably catastrophic. Though the impacts look despicably innocuous on first scan, a colder Europe, more intense weather, additional sea rise, invariably, this is described as the day after tomorrow scenario. And it is a strange twist of fate that so forgettable a movie has become the memorable shorthand for this particular worst-case nightmare. A shutdown of the conveyor belt is not a scenario that any credible scientists worry about on any human timescale. But a slowdown is another matter. Already, climate change has depressed the velocity of the Gulf Stream by as much as 15%, a development that scientists call an unprecedented event in the past millennium. Believed to be one reason the sea level rise along the east coast of the United States is dramatically higher than elsewhere in the world. And in 2018, two major papers triggered a new wave of concern over the conveyor belt, technically called Atlantic Meridional Overturning Circulation, which was found to be moving at its slowest rate in at least 1,500 years. This had happened about 100 years ahead of the schedule of even alarmed scientists and marked what the climate scientist Rachel Mann called ominously a tipping point. Further change, of course, is to come. The transformation of the ocean by warming, making these unknown waters doubly unknowable, remodeling the planet's seas before we ever were able to discover their depths, and all the life submerged there. Page 100. Unbreathable air. Our lungs need oxygen, but it is only a fraction of what we breathe, and the fraction tend to decline the more carbon in the atmosphere. That doesn't mean we are at risk of suffocation. Oxygen is far too abundant for that, but we will nevertheless suffer. With CO2 at 930 parts per million, more than double where we are today, cognitive ability declines by 21%. The effects are more pronounced indoors, where CO2 tends to build up. That's one reason you probably feel a little more awake when taking a brisk walk outside than you do after spending a long day inside with the windows closed. And it's also a reason elementary school classrooms have been found by one study to already average 1,000 parts per million, with almost a quarter of those surveyed in Texas, over 3,000, quite alarming numbers. Given that these are the environments where we've designed to promote intellectual performance. But classrooms are not the worst offenders. Other studies have shown even higher concentrations on airplanes, with effects you can probably groggily recall from past experience. But carbon is, more or less, the least of it. Going forward, the planet's air won't just be warmer, it will likely also be dirtier, more oppressive, and more sickening. Droughts have a direct impact on air quality, producing what is now known as dust exposure, and in the days of American Dust Bowl was called dust pneumonia. Climate change will bring new dust storms to those plains states, where deaths from dust pollution are expected to more than double and hospitalizations to triple. The hotter the planet gets, the more ozone forms, and by the middle of this century, Americans should suffer a 70% increase in days with unhealthy ozone smog. The National Center of Atmospheric Research has projected by the 2090s, as many as 2 billion people globally will be breathing air above the WHO safe level. Already, more than 10,000 people die from air pollution daily. There's considerably more each day than the total number of people who have ever been affected by the meltdowns of nuclear reactors. This is not a slam dunk argument in favor of nuclear power, of course, since the comparison isn't so neat. There are many more fossil fuel chimneys disgorging their trails of black smoke than fusion facilities, with their finger-trap towers and clouds of white vapor. But it is a startling mark of just how all-encompassing our regime of carbon pollution really is, enclosing the planet in a toxic swaddle. In recent years, researchers have uncovered a whole secret history of adversity woven into the experience of the last half-century by the hand of leaded gasoline and lead and lead paint, which seem to have dramatically increased rates of intellectual disability and criminality, and dramatically decreased educational attainment and lifetime earnings. Wherever they are introduced, the effects of air pollution seem starker already. Small particulate pollution, for instance, lowers cognitive performance over time so much that researchers call the effect huge. Reducing Chinese population to the EPA standard, for instance, would improve the country's verbal test scores by 13% and its math scores by 8%. Simple temperature rise has a robust and negative impact on test taking. 2. Scores go down when it's hotter outside. Pollution has been linked with increased mental illness in children and in the likelihood of dementia in adults. A higher pollution level in the year a baby is born has been shown to reduce earnings and labor force participation at age 30, and the relationship of pollution to premature births and low birth weight of babies is also strong. That the simple introduction of easy pass in American cities reduced both problems in the vivacity of toll plazas by 10.8% and 11.8% respectively, just by cutting down on the exhaust expelled when cars slowed to pay the toll. Then there's more familiar health threat from pollution, In 2013, melting Arctic ice remodeled Asian weather patterns, depriving industrial China of the natural wind ventilation patterns it had come to depend on, and as a result, blanketing much of the country's north in an unbearable smog. In obtuse, in obtuse seeming metric called the Air Quality Index categorizes the risks according to an idiosyncratic unit scale, tabulating the presence of a variety of pollutants. The warnings begin at 51 to 100 and at 201 to 300, include promises of significant increase in respiratory effects in the general population. The index tops out with the 301 to 500 range, warning of serious aggravation of heart or lung disease and premature mortality in persons with cardiopulmonary disease and the elderly, and serious risk of respiratory effects in the general population. At that level, everyone should avoid all outdoor exertion. The Chinese air apocalypse of 2013 doubled the high end of that super range, reaching a peak air quality index of 993, and scientists studying the phenomenon suggested that China had inadvertently invented the entirely new and unstudied kind of smog, one that combed the pea soup pollution of industrial era Europe, and the small particulate pollution that has lately contaminated so much of the developing world. That year, smog was responsible for 1.37 million deaths in the country. Outside of China, most saw the photographs and video of a world capital blanketed by gray, so thick it blotted out the sun as a sign, not of the state of the planet's atmosphere, but of just how backward that one country was, just how far China lagged behind the quality of life indices of the first world. Whatever its rapid economic growth suggested about its place in the global pecking order, then, in the record California wildfire season of 2017, the air around San Francisco was worse than on the same day in Beijing. In Nepal, the air quality index hit 486. In Los Angeles, there was a run on surgical masks. In Santa Barbara, residents scooped ash from their drainpipes by the handful. In Seattle, the following year, wildfire smoke made it unsafe for everyone everywhere to breathe outside, which gave Americans one more reason panic about their own health to look away from the situation in Delhi, where in 2017 the air quality index reached 999. The Indian capital is home to 26 million people. In 2017, simply breathing its air was the equivalent of smoking more than 2 packs of cigarettes a day, and local hospitals saw a patient surge of 20%. Runners in Delhi's half marathon competed with their heads wrapped by white masks. An air that thick with smut is hazardous in other ways. Visibility was so low that cars crashed in pileups on Delhi's freeways, and United canceled flights in and out of the city. New research shows that even short-term exposure to particulate pollution can dramatically increase rates of respiratory infections, with every additional 10 micrograms per cubic meter associated with a rise in diagnoses between 15 and 32%. Blood pressure goes up. Blood pressure goes up too. In 2017, the Lancet reported 9 million premature deaths globally were from small particulate pollution. More than a quarter were in India, and that was before final figures were in form that year's spike. In Delhi, much of the pollution comes from the burning of nearby farmland, but elsewhere small particulate smog is produced primarily by diesel and gas exhaust and other industrial activity. The public health damage is indiscriminate, touching nearly every human vulnerability. Pollution increases prevalence of stroke, heart disease, cancer of all kinds, acute and chronic respiratory diseases like asthma, and adverse pregnancy outcomes, including premature birth. New research into the behavioral and developmental effects is perhaps even scarier. Air pollution has been linked to worse memory, attention, and vocabulary, and to ADHD and autism spectrum disorders. Pollution has been shown to damage the development of neurons in the brain, and proximity to a coal plant can deform your DNA. In the developing world, 98% of cities are enveloped by air above the threshold of safety established by the WHO. WHO is an acronym, so it's WHO. Get out of urban areas and the problem doesn't much improve. 95% of the world's population is breathing dangerously polluted air. Since 2013, China has undertaken an unprecedented cleanup of its air, but as of 2015, pollution was still killing more than 1 million Chinese each year. Globally, 1 out of 6 deaths is caused by air pollution. Pollution like this isn't news in any meaningful sense. You can find omens about the toxicity of smog and the dangers of blackened air. For instance, in the writing of Charles Dickens, rarely appreciated as an environmentalist. But every year we are discovering more and more ways in which our industrial activity is poisoning the planet. One particular note of alarm has been struck by what seems likely an entirely new or newly understood pollution threat: microplastics. Global warming did not bring us microplastics in any direct way, and yet their rapid conquest of our natural world has become an irresistible fable about just what kind of transformation is meant by the word Anthropocene, and just how much the world's booming consumer culture is to blame. Environmentalists probably know already about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, the mass of plastic, twice the size of Texas, floating freely in the Pacific Ocean. It is not actually an island. In fact, it is not actually a stable mass, only rhetorically convenient for us to think of it that way. And it is mostly composed of larger scale plastics of the kind visible to the human eye. The microscopic bits, 700,000 of them, can be released into the surrounding environment by a single washing machine cycle, are more insidious. And believe it or not, more pervasive. A quarter of fish sold in Indonesia and California contain plastics. According to one recent study, European eaters of shellfish, one estimate has suggested, consume one, at least 11,000 bits each year. The direct effect on ocean life is even more striking. The total number of marine species said to be adversely affected by plastic pollution has risen from 260 in 1995, when the first assessment was carried out, to 690 in 2015 and 1,450 in 2018. A majority of fish tested in the Great Lakes contained microplastics, as did the guts of 73% of fish surveyed in the Northwest Atlantic. One UK supermarket study found that every 100 grams of mussels were infected with 70 particles of plastic. Some fish have learned to eat plastic, and certain species of krill are now functioning as plastic processing plants, churning microplastics into smaller bits that scientists are now calling nanoplastics. But krill can't grind it all down. In 1 square mile of water near Toronto, 3.4 million microplastic particles are recently trawled. Of course, seabirds are not immune. One researcher found 225 pieces of plastic in the stomach of a single 3-month-old chick, weighing 10% of its body mass, the equivalent of an average human carrying about 10 to 20 pounds of plastic in the distended belly. Imagine having to take your first flight out to sea with all that in your stomach, the researcher told the Financial Times, adding, around the world, seabirds are declining faster than any other bird group. Microplastics have been found in beer, honey, and 16 of 17 tested brands of commercial sea salt across 8 different countries. The more we test, the more we find, and while nobody yet knows the health impact on humans, in the oceans, a plastic microbead is said to be 1 million times more toxic than the water around it. Chances are, if we started slicing open human cadavers to look for microplastics, as we are beginning to do with tau proteins, the supposed markers of CTE and Alzheimer's, we'd be finding plastic in our own flesh too. We can breathe in microplastics even when indoors, where they've been detected suspended in the air, and do already drink them. They are found in the tap water of 94% of all tested American cities. And global plastic production is expected to triple by 2050, when there will be more plastic in the ocean than fish. That's a damn shame. Oh my god. I'm gonna keep reading. We got like 2 pages left, guys, so hang in there. But I just had to say that. That's a damn shame. I don't know how, but there's gotta be some way to stop like single-use plastic. I don't even care if we start with straws. If we need to start with straws, start with them, because that is disgusting. Anyway, plastic panic has a strange relationship to climate change, in that it seems to draw on premonitions about the degradation of the planet, while focusing on something that has very little to do with global warming. But it's not only carbon emissions that are tied up in climate change. Other pollution is too. One of the connections is relatively attenuated. attenuated. Plastics are produced by industrial activity that also produces pollutants, including carbon dioxide. A second is more direct, but, in the scheme of things, trivial. When plastics degrade, they release methane and ethylene, another powerful greenhouse gas. But a third relationship between non-carbon pollution and the temperature of the planet is far more horrifying. This is not the problem of plastic, but of aerosol pollution, the blanket term for any particles suspended in our atmosphere. Aerosol particles actually suppress global temperature, mostly by reflecting sunlight back into outer space. In other words, all of the non-carbon pollution we've exhausted from our power plants and our factories and our automobiles, suffocating some of the largest and most prosperous cities of the world, and co-signing many millions of the lucky to hospital beds, and many millions of others to early deaths. All of the pollution has been perversely reducing the amount of global warming we are currently experiencing. How much? Probably about half a degree, and possibly more. Already, aerosols have been reflecting so much sunlight away from the Earth that, in the industrial era, the planet has only heated up 2/3 as much as it would have otherwise. If we had somehow managed to produce precisely the same volume of carbon emissions since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution as we have, while somehow keeping the skies clear of aerosol pollution, the temperature rise would be half again higher than it is now. The result is what the Nobel laureate Paul Crutzen has called a catch-22, and what the climate writer Eric Holothos has described perhaps more intensively as a devil's bargain, a choice between public health destroying pollution on one hand, and on the other, clear skies whose very clearness and healthiness will dramatically accelerate climate change. Eliminate that pollution and you save millions of lives each year, but also create a dramatic spike in warming. That would bring us to about 1.5 or 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial baseline, pushing us right up to the threshold of 2 degrees of warming, long thought to be the borders separating a livable future from climate catastrophe. For almost a generation now, engineers and futurists have contemplated the practical implications of this phenomenon, and the prospect of suppressing global temperature with a program of suspended particles, that is, polluting the air on purpose to keep the planet cooler, often grouped together under the umbrella term geoengineering. This prospect has been received by the public as a worst-case scenario, nearly science fiction, and has, in fact, informed much of the recent sci-fi that has addressed itself to the climate crisis. And yet, it has gained a terrific amount of currency among the most concerned climate scientists, many of whom will also note that none of the quite modest goals of the Paris Climate Accords can be achieved without negative emissions technologies, at present prohibitively expensive. Carbon capture may indeed prove to be magical thinking, but the cruder technologies we know these will work. Rather than sucking carbon out of the atmosphere, we could shoot pollution into the sky on purpose. Perhaps the most plausible version involves sulfur dioxide that would turn our sunsets very red, would bleach the sky, would make more acid rain. It would also cause tens of thousands of additional premature deaths each year through its effect on air quality. A 2018 paper suggested it would rapidly dry the Amazon, producing many more wildfires. The negative effect on plant growth would entirely cancel out the positive effect on global temperature, according to another 2018 paper. In other words, at least in terms of agricultural yield, solar geoengineering would offer no net benefit at all. Once we begin such a program, we could never stop. Even a brief interruption, a temporary dispersal of our red sulfur umbrella, could send the planet plunging several degrees of warming forward into a climate abyss, which would make whatever installations were sustaining that umbrella quite vulnerable to political gamesmanship and terrorism, as its advocates themselves would acknowledge. And yet many scientists still describe geoengineering as an inevitably it's just so cheap, they say. Even an environmentalist billionaire going rogue can make it happen on their own. Okay, so we read 3 chapters in one video. We're gonna stop right there. The next chapter is Plagues of Warming, and I think I'm gonna read like 3 chapters each video, so then it'll be an hour every video. So the next 3 chapters will be Plagues of Warming, Economic Collapse, and Climate Conflict. Yeah. Yeah, so those are the 3 that are coming up. And just in case you guys wanted to know what are the other chapters he's going to be talking about systems and the after climate conflict, and then he's going to say storytelling, crisis, capitalism, the church of technology, politics of consumption, history after progress, and ethics at the end of the world. And then the anthropic principle. And then after that, it's acknowledgments, notes, and index. Yeah. I don't know if you want me to read no, I don't think. What about the notes? No, I don't think you want me to read that. Okay, anyway, thank you for listening. Goodbye. Have a great night. And yeah, love you guys.